The slap cracked across the great hall like a pistol shot, and the infant in her arms did not even flinch, because the infant had already learned, in only 9 months of life, that the world was a place of sudden noises. Blood bloomed at the corner of the Duchess's mouth. She did not raise her hand to her face. She did not raise her eyes to the woman who had struck her. She only tightened her hold on the small bundle of linen and warmth pressed against her breast, and whispered, so softly that only the child could hear, that she would never let anyone strike him again. Behind her, the long table of relations gasped in that practiced, theatrical way that aristocrats gasp when they wish to be seen disapproving while doing nothing. A footman in pale blue livery stared at the floor. A great-aunt fanned herself with a painted silk fan and murmured that really, the Duchess had brought this upon herself by parading the bastard about like a son. And the Duke, her husband, the man whose name she carried, the man whose ring still sat upon her finger, looked away into the fire as though the fire were the only honest thing in the room. What happened in that hall over the next 6 months would unmake 3 fortunes, empty 2 estates, and put a coffin in the family crypt that no one had expected to fill. But that is the end of the story, and we have not even begun it. Before we step backward into the rooms where this began, take one small moment for me. If stories of quiet women and loud reckonings are the stories you came here to hear, tap the subscribe button now. Leave a like so the algorithm carries this tale to others who love it. And in the comments tell me the country and the hour from which you are listening tonight, because I want to know how far this voice travels. Now then, settle in. Pour something warm. Let me take you back to the spring in which Henrietta Velmont, Duchess of Dunhollow, first learned that her husband had a child by another woman, and that the child had been left, swaddled and starving, upon the gravel of her own front steps. Hartwell Court stood at the crown of a long green valley, its pale stone walls the colour of weak tea in the morning and the colour of bruised plums at dusk, and it had stood there for 400 years before Henrietta Velmont entered it as a bride. She had come to it at 22, a quiet woman with dark hair the colour of wet earth and eyes the colour of the slate roofs of the cottages her father had owned in the north, and she had brought with her a dowry so vast that the steward had needed 3 days to record it in the household ledger. Her father had been a man of trade, of shipping and of mining, and of patient, ruthless wealth, and her mother had been a baroness of an old and threadbare line, and Henrietta had inherited from each of them the quality the other had lacked. She had her father's accounts and her mother's silences. She had been raised to understand that money, well kept, was a kind of armour, and that a woman of station who let others manage her fortune would soon find she had neither fortune nor station. And so, even on her wedding day, even as the bells of the chapel of Dunhollow rang her into her new name, she had quietly signed 3 documents that her husband never read, documents that placed every acre of her dowry, every share of her father's shipping company, every brick of the 4 townhouses that had come to her on her mother's death, into a trust that answered only to her and to a small grey lawyer in the capital named Mr. Bramwell. She did this not from suspicion. She did it from habit. A woman taught to count does not stop counting because a man has put a ring upon her hand. The Duke, her husband, was named Cassian Pelosi Velmont, 11th of his line, and he was handsome in the way that portraits of dukes are always handsome, which is to say tall and pale and a little tired about the eyes. He had been kind to her at first, in the absent way that a man is kind to a horse he is pleased to own. He had walked with her in the long gallery and pointed out his ancestors. He had taught her the names of the rose varieties in the south garden. He had, on their wedding night, been gentle, and on the mornings after he had been distant, and Henrietta had understood, as women of her time were trained to understand, that this was simply the shape of marriage among their kind. She did not love him. She did not yet dislike him. She kept her own counsel, ran the household with the precision of a clockmaker, and waited to see what sort of life she had married into. For 2 years the answer was a quiet one. They dined together on Sundays. They rode together on Wednesdays. He went often to the capital on business of his own, and she did not ask what the business was, because women of her station were not meant to ask. She read in the long library. She corresponded with her lawyer. She visited the tenants on the estate and learned the names of their children, and the children, in turn, learned that the new Duchess was a woman who remembered names, which is the rarest currency among the powerful. It was in the 3rd spring of her marriage that the basket arrived. A footman found it at dawn, set upon the lowest of the 7 stone steps that climbed to the great oak doors of Hartwell Court, and inside the basket, wrapped in a piece of linen that had been hemmed by a hand that knew its work, lay a child. A boy, perhaps 3 months old, with hair the colour of new wheat and eyes the same pale, tired grey as the Duke's. Pinned to the linen was a letter, and the letter, written in a fine, sloping hand that was not the hand of a servant, said only that the child's mother had died of fever in the lying-in hospital in the capital, that the child was the natural son of his Grace, the Duke of Dunhollow, and that she who wrote, being the dying mother's sister, could not keep him. The letter was unsigned. The footman, white-faced, carried the basket and the letter to the housekeeper. The housekeeper, white-faced, carried the basket and the letter to the Duchess. And the Duchess, who had been at her breakfast of soft eggs and brown toast and weak tea, set down her cup very carefully, read the letter twice, looked into the basket once, and said in a voice so even that the housekeeper would later swear it had frightened her more than weeping, that the child would stay. The Duke, when he was sent for, came down the long staircase 2 steps at a time, which was a thing she had never seen him do, and when he saw the basket and the letter, his face went the colour of the cold ashes in the breakfast-room grate. He did not speak for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice she had also never heard from him, that there had been a misunderstanding, that the woman had been nothing to him, that the child could not possibly be his, that he would have the basket taken to the parish and the matter forgotten before noon. Henrietta listened to all of this without moving. When he was finished, she rose from her chair, lifted the child out of the basket with the practised grace of a woman who had been the eldest of 7, settled him against her shoulder, and said, quite clearly, that the child had been brought to her door with her husband's name written upon him, and that until such a time as it could be proven otherwise, the child was a Velmont, and Velmonts were not sent to parish workhouses while she drew breath. The Duke stared at her. The housekeeper stared at the floor. The child made a small, contented sound and tucked his fist beneath his chin. And in that small sound, Henrietta Velmont, who had not been able to love her husband, found something in the world that she could love at once and entirely. And the love arrived so suddenly and so completely that she nearly laughed aloud at the unfairness of it. She named the child Leor, after a brother of her mother's who had died young, and she gave him the second name Velmont, because she would give no child in her house anything less, and she installed him in the old nursery in the east wing, the nursery that had not been used since the Duke himself had been a boy, and she hired a wet nurse from the village whose own infant had been stillborn the week before, and who wept the first time she held Leor, and said that God had not, after all, forgotten her. The Duke did not protest the installation. The Duke, in fact, said almost nothing about the child at all in the weeks that followed. He left for the capital within the fortnight and stayed there longer than usual. And when he returned, he did not visit the nursery. And when Henrietta brought the boy down to the drawing-room, he found reasons to be elsewhere. She did not press him. She had learned, in 3 years of marriage, that pressing Cassian Valmont produced only further distances. She let him have his silences, and she kept the child, and she wrote, very quietly, to Mr. Bramwell in the capital, and asked him to make certain discreet inquiries regarding the lying-in hospital in the spring, and the death of a young woman of fever, and the parentage of an infant boy. Mr. Bramwell wrote back that he would attend to the matter. He always did. The trouble began, as trouble in such houses always begins, with the arrival of the Duke's elder sister. Her name was Lavinia Crewe, and she had been born a Valmont and married into the Crews of the southern coast, and she had been widowed at 30 and had lived ever since as though widowhood were a stage upon which she performed the role of tragic beauty for any audience that would attend. She was, at the time of these events, 41 years old, and she remained handsome in the cold, polished way of a woman who had given a great deal of effort to remaining handsome. Her hair was the color of old gold. Her dresses were always one shade darker than mourning. She wore at her throat a black pearl the size of a quail's egg, which she had taken from her late husband's mother on the afternoon of the funeral, and she liked to say that the pearl had chosen her. She arrived at Hartwell Court within a month of the child's appearance, ostensibly to comfort her dear brother in his unfortunate domestic embarrassment, and she brought with her a quantity of trunks that suggested she did not intend to leave before autumn. She made her position regarding the child known within an hour of her arrival. The child, she said, sweeping into the drawing-room in a rustle of charcoal silk, was a stain upon the house. The child was the natural production of some chambermaid or worse, and it was beneath the dignity of a Valmont Duchess to suckle the bye-blow of a stranger as though she were a peasant, nursing a foundling for the parish penny. Henrietta, who was at that moment sitting in the window-seat, with Leor asleep on her lap, and a book of Italian poetry open beside her, looked up, marked her place in the book with a thin silk ribbon, and replied that the child was not suckled, having a wet nurse, and was not a stain, being only an infant, and that the dignity of a Valmont Duchess was a matter she would judge for herself, having married into the title without anyone's assistance, and being capable of carrying it without anyone's instruction. Lavinia's smile thinned to the width of a knife. From that moment on the war was declared, though only one of the combatants had agreed to fight it. Lavinia's strategy was patient and small. She did not strike at Henrietta directly. She struck at the child. She arranged for the nursery fire to be allowed to die at night, until Henrietta caught the maid responsible and dismissed her with a month's wages and a written character that mentioned, with great delicacy, the matter of the fire. She suggested at dinner, in front of the visiting vicar, that perhaps the boy might be sent to a respectable family in the north, where his presence would not embarrass the house, and Henrietta replied, with great courtesy, that the boy was not an embarrassment to her, and that the vicar might be more interested to hear about the new roof she was funding for the parish school. She bribed the wet nurse to leave, offering her twice her wages to go home to her village, and the wet nurse, weeping, came directly to Henrietta and confessed, and Henrietta thanked her and doubled her wages herself and asked her to stay, and she stayed. Each small attack, blunted, taught Lavinia only that she must strike harder. And under it all, beneath the elder sister's poisoned attentions, Henrietta began to notice something else, something stranger. The Duke himself, her husband, had begun to watch the child with an expression she could not read. Not love, not even guilt. Something colder. Something almost like fear. It was in the 5th month after Leor's arrival that Henrietta made her decision to disguise herself, though the word disguise is too theatrical for what she actually did. She simply began to absent herself, in small ways, from the rooms in which her sister-in-law was at work. She put on the plainest of her mourning gowns, a dove-grey wool with no trim, and she pinned her hair beneath a simple linen cap of the sort the upper servants wore, and she carried the child herself into the back corridors and the kitchen gardens and the laundry yards, and she listened. She listened to what the servants said when they believed only another servant was within earshot. She listened to what Lavinia said to the lady's maid she had brought from the southern coast, a sharp-faced woman named Tamsin Quill, when they believed themselves alone in the morning-room. She listened to what the Duke said to his sister in the library after the household had gone to bed. And what she heard, accumulated patiently over weeks, was a portrait of a conspiracy so cold and so practical that it took her breath away. The conversation that broke the matter open occurred on a Tuesday evening in the small library, the one that opened off the music room, the one with the door that did not quite close because the hinge had warped in a summer of damp 2 years before, and no one had thought to mend it. Henrietta had come down the back stairs in her grey wool, the child asleep against her shoulder in a sling she had made herself from an old shawl, and she had heard her husband's voice through the half-open door, and she had stopped in the dark of the passage and stood very still. Cassian was speaking, low and tight, of money. He owed, he said, more than he could name. The shipping investments he had made in the spring had collapsed. The mortgage on the southern farms had come due. He had borrowed against the wine cellar, and against the library, and against the portraits in the long gallery, and the men to whom he had borrowed were no longer patient men. Lavinia's voice, low and silken, answered him. There was a way, she said. There had always been a way. The Duchess's fortune, she said, was the largest in 3 counties, and it sat untouched in trust, and a trust could be broken, and a wife could be set aside, and a wife who had been so foolish as to take a bastard child into her arms and call it her son had given them, between her own 2 hands, the very weapon they required. A wife who could be shown to have brought a strange child into the line of succession. A wife who could be shown to have done so against her husband's will. A wife who could be shown to be unfit, hysterical, given to fancies, given to charity beyond reason. Such a wife, Lavinia said, could be put aside, and the trust could be challenged, and the fortune could come into the house where it belonged, and the house could be saved. Henrietta stood in the dark passage, with the warm, sleeping child against her shoulder, and she did not move, and she did not breathe, and she listened as her husband's voice, after a long silence, said quietly that yes, it could be done. She listened as Lavinia said that the child himself was the proof they required. She listened as Lavinia said, with a small, satisfied laugh, that of course the boy was not Cassian's son at all. The boy, she said, was the natural child of a woman in the capital named Cressida Vane, who had been Lavinia's own friend, and who had agreed for a sum to allow her infant to be placed upon the steps of Hartwell Court with a letter naming the Duke as father. The letter had been written by Lavinia herself in a hand she had practiced for 3 weeks. The whole affair, she said, had been her invention from the beginning, designed to lure the soft-hearted little Duchess into the precise trap she had so obligingly walked into. And Cassian, her brother, her weak and indebted brother, had agreed to the scheme because he had no other way left to him. The child meant nothing to anyone. The child was a key. The child would unlock the Duchess's fortune, and would then, when the matter was finished, be returned to its mother or sent quietly to a foundling house in the north, where no one would think of it again. Henrietta listened until she had heard enough. Then she carried the child, who had not woken, back up the dark stairs to the nursery, and she laid him in the cradle, and she sat beside the cradle for a long time, with her hands folded very tightly in her lap. She did not weep. She did not pace. She thought about the letter from the lying-in hospital. She thought about the wet nurse from the village. She thought about her husband's grey, tired eyes, and about the way he had looked into the fire on the night the child was struck. She thought about Lior, who had done nothing in his short life except be born to a woman who hadn't wanted him, and she thought about how completely she had come to love him, and she thought about how that love, which she had taken for the only honest thing in her life, had been engineered by her enemies as the bait in a trap. And then she thought about something else. She thought about how a trap, once seen, becomes a tool. She thought about how a key, once recognized, can unlock more than one door. And she thought about Mr. Bramwell, her small grey lawyer in the capital, and the inquiries he had been quietly making for 5 months now, and the answers he had already begun to send back. She rose. She sat down at the small writing desk in the corner of the nursery, and by the light of a single candle she wrote 3 letters. The first was to Mr. Bramwell. The second was to a physician of her acquaintance in the capital, a man of new methods and discreet habits who had pioneered, in recent years, certain new techniques for the comparison of blood and tissue, techniques that could determine, with a precision unknown to previous generations, whether 2 persons shared a common parent. The third letter was to her father's elder brother, the Earl of Marsham, who had loved her since she was a child, and who had once told her that if any man ever harmed her, he had only to be informed, and the matter would be attended to. She sealed all 3 letters with the small, plain seal she used for her private correspondence, the one that bore no crest at all, only her own initials, and she gave them at dawn to the undergroom whom she trusted, and she sent him riding for the capital, with instructions to deliver each into the recipient's own hand. The weeks that followed were the strangest of her life, for she had to live, under the same roof, with the 2 people who were now openly her enemies, and she had to live as though she suspected nothing. She rose at the same hour. She took her breakfast at the same table. She greeted Lavinia in the morning room with the same small, grave courtesy she had always offered her, and she sat across from Cassian at dinner and asked him, with the same mild interest, about his correspondence and his rides. She carried the child openly through the rooms of the house and let him be admired by visitors, and when Lavinia made her little barbed comments about the boy's complexion or his crying, or the unsuitability of a duchess for the nursery, Henrietta smiled the small smile she had learned from her mother, and replied with something so courteous it took the sting from the room. Inside, she was a woman counting hours. Inside, she was a woman who had begun to draw up, in the small leather notebook she kept locked in the drawer of her writing desk, a list of names and dates and overheard sentences. Every one of them entered in her precise small hand, every one of them initialed and dated, every one of them ready to be carried, when the time came, to a court of law or to a room full of witnesses, whichever proved the more useful arena. Mr. Bramwell answered her first. His letter came in a plain envelope by the ordinary post, and it said, in the dry, careful prose she had known all her life, that he had made the inquiries she had requested, and that the results were of considerable interest. There had indeed been a woman named Cressida Vane, delivered of a male infant in the lying-in hospital in the capital in the previous winter. The woman had not died of fever. The woman was, in fact, alive and in good health, and living in a set of rooms in the eastern quarter of the capital, rooms whose rent was being paid quarterly through a bank in the city, by an account belonging to the Lady Lavinia Crewe. The child had been removed from the hospital 3 weeks after its birth, against the wishes of the attending matron, by a woman who had given her name as a relation, but who had been recognized by one of the nurses, a sharp-eyed girl from the southern coast who had grown up near the Crewe estate, as the lady's maid, Tamsin Quill. Mr. Bramwell had taken sworn statements from the matron and from the nurse. He had also obtained, by methods he did not describe, a copy of the bank's quarterly disbursements. He enclosed all of it with his letter. He added, in a postscript, that the physician of New Methods had received her second letter and had expressed himself entirely willing to undertake the comparison she had requested, and would await, at his rooms in the capital, the arrival of the necessary samples whenever she found it convenient to provide them. Henrietta read the letter twice in the locked privacy of her sitting-room, and then she folded it carefully and placed it inside the leather notebook in the drawer. And then she sat for a long while, looking out of the window at the long green slope of the valley falling away from the house. She had her proof now, or the better part of it. She had the woman alive who was meant to be dead. She had the maid who had stolen the child. She had the bank that paid the rent. She had the matron and the nurse who would testify. She had everything she required to expose the conspiracy and to set the trap in reverse. And yet she did not act. She waited. She waited because she understood, with the patience that her father had taught her, that a single shot at such people had to be a killing shot, and that to fire too early was to lose everything. She required one piece more. She required the physician's comparison. She required the science that would prove, beyond the contradiction of any peer or magistrate, that the child she had taken to her heart was not, after all, the natural son of her husband, and that the entire premise of the conspiracy collapsed on its own foundation. For if the child was not Cassian's, then her husband had never had a natural heir at all, and the whole pretense of bringing the boy into the line of succession had been, from the first morning, a fraud manufactured by Lavinia for the purpose of breaking the trust. To obtain the comparison, she needed a sample of the child's blood and a sample of her husband's, and the second was the harder by far. She solved the first easily, on a morning when Leor was teething and his small gums had bled a little onto the corner of the linen napkin she had used to soothe them, and she folded that napkin and sealed it in a small oilskin packet and addressed it to the physician in the capital under a false name. The second she solved by means of a barber. The Duke, who was vain in the small ways that vain men are vain, had his hair trimmed every fortnight by an itinerant barber from the village, and after each trimming, the clippings were swept into a paper twist and burned in the kitchen fire. Henrietta, on the morning of the next trimming, happened to be in the back passage by the kitchen at the precise moment the kitchen maid was carrying the paper twist to the grate, and she happened to inquire whether the maid had remembered to also burn the rags from the morning room. And the maid, flustered, set down the paper twist on the side table and ran to attend to the rags. And when the maid returned, the paper twist was, of course, still there, untouched, exactly as she had left it. Henrietta took it to her sitting-room and divided the contents into a second oilskin packet, and sealed it and labelled it and put it with the first, and she gave both packets to the same trusted undergroom, and the undergroom rode again for the capital, and 10 days later she received from the physician of New Methods a letter that contained, in his clear scientific prose, the answer she had been waiting for. The child and the Duke shared no blood relation that the physician's methods could detect. The hair belonged to a man whose blood markers, as the physician termed them, were of a category entirely distinct from those of the infant whose sample had been provided. The physician was prepared, he said, to swear to this finding before any tribunal she should name, and to defend his methods against any expert who should be brought to challenge them. He had, he added in a careful postscript, retained sealed duplicate samples of both materials in his own laboratory, against the possibility that the originals should be challenged or destroyed. He remained, he said, her obedient servant. Henrietta read this letter 3 times. Then she rose, walked to the nursery, lifted Leor from his cradle, and held him for a long while in the slant of afternoon light that fell through the east window. He was warm. He smelled of milk and clean linen. He made the small, contented sound he always made when she held him, the sound that had broken her on the first morning, the sound that had been engineered by clever, cruel people to break her exactly as it had. She thought, holding him, that the cruelty of the trap did not change the truth of the love. The love was hers. The child was hers by every measure that mattered to her. And the proof in her hand was not a thing that would take him from her. The proof was a thing that would protect him forever from the people who had used him as a key. Her uncle, the Earl of Marsham, answered her 3rd letter in person. He arrived at Hartwell Court on a Thursday afternoon in late autumn, in a travelling carriage drawn by 4 black horses, accompanied by 2 outriders and his own personal secretary, and he sent in his card with the air of a man making a perfectly ordinary family visit. He was 71 years old. He was small and white-haired, and stooped a little at the shoulders, and he wore a dark green travelling coat that had been cut for him by the same tailor for 40 years. He had, in his lifetime, sat in 3 governments, and presided over 2 royal commissions, and refused a marquisate on the grounds that he preferred the title he was born to, and there was not a magistrate in the kingdom who did not know his name. Lavinia, who received him in the drawing-room, because Henrietta happened to be upstairs with the child, was visibly thrown by his arrival, and she covered her confusion with a great quantity of charming chatter about the long road from the capital, and the unseasonable weather, and the great honour of his visit. The Earl, who had known Lavinia Crewe since she was a girl of 11, and had disliked her even then, allowed her to chatter without interruption for a full quarter of an hour, watching her over the rim of his teacup with the expression of a man examining a specimen he was not quite ready to name. And when Henrietta came down at last with Leor in her arms, the Earl rose, crossed the room, took the child from her, with the practised ease of a man who had raised 4 of his own and 7 grandchildren, and announced to the room at large that the boy was a splendid little fellow, and that he intended to spend the evening getting to know him. He stayed 3 days. In those 3 days he did not, in Lavinia's hearing, say a single thing that could be construed as anything other than a relation's affectionate visit. He walked in the long gallery with Cassian and admired the portraits. He took tea with Lavinia and complimented her dress. He played in the nursery with the child and read aloud in the library from a volume of essays, and dined at the long table with perfect courtesy. And in the small hours of each night, in Henrietta's locked sitting-room, he read her notebook, examined Mr. Bramwell's documents, studied the physician's letter, and spoke with her in the low, careful voice of a man who had spent his life dismantling conspiracies about the precise shape of the trap she had built. On the 3rd evening he closed the notebook, removed his spectacles, polished them on a square of grey silk, and told her that her preparation was, in his professional opinion, perfect, and that the only remaining question was the arena. A matter of this delicacy, he said, could be brought to court, in which case it would consume 2 years of her life and a great deal of money, and would be in the newspapers every week, or it could be brought to the family itself in a single evening, before witnesses chosen for their authority and their discretion, and could be ended in an hour. The choice, he said, was hers. Henrietta chose the evening. She chose it because she did not wish Leor's name to appear in any newspaper in the kingdom for the rest of his life, and because she had a particular feeling about the shape that justice ought to take in a house, and because she had been, for nearly 6 months, the silent and patient witness of a great deal of casual cruelty, and she wished, when the cruelty was answered, for it to be answered in the same rooms where it had been committed. The Earl nodded once. He said he would attend to the witnesses. He left the next morning in his green coat and his black carriage, and within a week the invitations began to arrive at Hartwell Court for the autumn dinner that Lavinia had been planning for some months, a dinner intended to introduce the recovering Duke and his foolish little wife, and the embarrassing question of the foundling to a carefully chosen circle of county worthies who could be relied upon to spread, by the following morning, whatever narrative Lavinia wished spread. The guest list, which Lavinia had drawn up herself, included the Lord Lieutenant of the county, the bishop, 2 magistrates, a dowager marchioness with a famous tongue, and the editor of the regional paper. Henrietta, who reviewed the list at Lavinia's insistence, made only one addition. She asked, with great mildness, whether her uncle, the Earl of Marsham, might not also be invited, since he had so enjoyed his recent visit, and Lavinia, who could not refuse without giving offence, agreed through teeth that did not quite unclench. Henrietta, smiling her small grave smile, then asked also whether they might invite the local physician, an old country doctor named Lockerby, who was a friend of the family, and Lavinia, finding this even more impossible to refuse, agreed again. The list was sealed. The invitations went out. The dinner was set for the last Friday in October. In the weeks before the dinner, Henrietta moved through her own house, like a woman who had already left it. She walked the long gallery and looked at the portraits of the Velmont ancestors, and thought, without sentiment, that none of them had any further claim upon her. She walked the south garden and stood among the roses that Cassian had taught her the names of, and felt, for the first time, that she had only ever liked the roses, and never the man who named them. She visited the tenants, whose names she had learned, and she sat in their kitchens and drank their thin tea and listened to their troubles, and she made, in her own private mind, certain quiet provisions for them that would survive whatever happened at the dinner and whatever followed it. She wrote a long letter to the wet nurse, whose name was Annie Marsh, in which she asked Annie whether she would be willing, in the event that the household at Hartwell Court should be dissolved, to come north with the Duchess and the child to a small estate the Duchess owned in her own right near the sea, and Annie wrote back the same day in her round, laborious schoolroom hand that she would follow the child to the ends of the earth and the Duchess with him. Henrietta folded the letter, kissed it once for reasons she did not entirely understand, and placed it in the drawer with the others. 2 nights before the dinner, Cassian came to her sitting room. He had not been in that room for nearly a year. He knocked, which was a thing he had never done in his life, and when she bid him enter, he came in slowly, and he stood by the door, and he looked at her where she sat by the fire, with Leor asleep against her shoulder, and he said, in a voice she hadn't heard since the first months of their marriage, that he was sorry. He did not say for what. He did not have to. She looked at him for a long moment over the small, warm head of the sleeping child, and she saw, perhaps for the first time, the whole shape of the man she had married. A weak man, a frightened man, a man who had inherited a great name and no instrument with which to carry it, a man who had been led by a stronger and crueler sister into a scheme he had not the spine to refuse and had not the spine to confess. She did not hate him. She found, to her own faint surprise, that she could not even quite muster contempt. She felt for him the small, distant pity one feels for an animal that has been mistreated by another animal. She said quietly that she was glad he had come. She said that she hoped, on Friday evening, he would find within himself the courage to tell the truth when the moment came. Because the moment, she told him, was coming, and it would come whether he was ready for it or not. And the only choice remaining to him was the choice of which side of it he wished to stand on. He stared at her. He opened his mouth to ask what she meant. She did not answer. She only looked at him steadily until he closed his mouth again and bowed his head and turned and left the room. He did not sleep that night. She knew, because she heard him pacing the long gallery until dawn. Friday came clear and cold, with a thin white frost on the lawns and a low sun the colour of brass behind the bare trees. The kitchens of Hartwell Court had been working since Wednesday morning. There were to be 22 at table. There was to be clear soup, and turbot in a sauce of capers and lemon, and a saddle of mutton with red currant jelly, and a brace of pheasants roasted with chestnuts, and a great raised pie of game from the home farm. And after these, the sweets, the trembling jellies in 3 colours, the syllabub in tall glasses, the pears poached in spiced wine, the small dark cakes flavoured with almond, the dish of hothouse grapes, the colour of amethysts that had been sent down from the glass houses at the back of the kitchen garden. There were to be 3 wines, a hock for the fish, a claret for the meat, a port for the cheese, and a sweet golden wine from a vineyard the Duke had once owned and lost. The long dining room had been opened and aired, and the great chandelier let down and rekindled and hauled up again, and the 82 pieces of the dinner service had been counted and washed and counted again, and the silver had been polished by 2 footmen for a day and a half. Lavinia, in a dress of dark plum silk that flattered her gold hair, moved through the rooms like a general before a battle, and Henrietta, in a gown of deep grey velvet with no ornament at all except her mother's small pearl earrings, moved through them like a woman keeping an appointment with the future. The guests began to arrive at 6. Their carriages crunched up the long gravel drive in a steady procession, and the lamps in the great hall threw long, warm squares of light across the cold stones of the entrance court, and the footman in pale blue livery handed down the dowagers and the magistrates, and the bishop and the editor of the regional paper, and Lavinia received them at the foot of the great staircase, with her practised smile and her pretty laugh, and her hand extended in just the angle that suggested it might be kissed by those who were entitled to such gestures. The Lord Lieutenant arrived at 6:15 in a coach with the county arms on the door. The bishop arrived at past, in a smaller carriage and a great cloak. The Earl of Marsham arrived last of all at 7:10, in his green travelling coat and his unfussy carriage, accompanied this time not only by his secretary, but by 2 further gentlemen, one of whom carried a leather case of the sort that lawyers use, and the other of whom carried nothing at all but observed the hall with the careful eyes of a man whose profession was observation. Lavinia, greeting the Earl, glanced at his 2 companions with a flicker of unease, and asked, with her brightest smile, whether she should have places set for them at table. The Earl smiled back, equally brightly, and said that yes, she should, and that he was certain there was room. Lavinia turned to the butler and gave the order, and the butler bowed, and the party moved into the drawing-room, and the long evening began.